Now, I know there are probably some of you who clicked on this video only to comment something along the lines of, no matter what Disney does, they can never hope to be on par with George Lucas, that he is Star Wars and what Disney is doing to his galaxy far, far away is a travesty. And if that's how you feel, then by all means, let me know in the comments below, because this is what I call my weekly discussion video, where I bring up a topic, give my thoughts on it both ways, trying to stay mostly objective and impartial, before opening it up to all of you to tell me what you think, and then next weekend I'll make a follow-up video delving into what you all had to say on the matter. And for those of you who follow my channel, you might recall not too long ago I brought up a very similar question, when I asked you to basically rate the first 5 years of Star Wars under Disney. But the reason I'm bringing this up again now is because, as you know, The Last Jedi comes out later this week, and I'm really curious to see how people feel about Disney right before seeing this movie, and how they'll feel after. So this is likely going to be a 3-part series, starting with the initial question here before everyone's seen the movie. Then I'll basically ask the same question again next weekend after most of us have probably seen it, and then a final part the following weekend where I'll compare and contrast how The Last Jedi may have changed your opinion one way or the other. Okay, so with all that said, let me get into it and start by being a little less than impartial and say that I am, to no one's surprise, a huge fan of George Lucas. I've loved Star Wars literally my whole life, and it has inspired me and shaped the person I am in probably more ways than I even realize. Simply put, George Lucas is the reason I'm here today, talking to all of you, and why we have this amazing galaxy far, far away for us all to enjoy and share. His importance to Star Wars and the work he put into it cannot be overstated, and his legacy is not in any way, shape, or form what I'm trying to question here. What I am going to ask you, however, is if Star Wars, in some respects, is better off in the hands of Disney at this point in its existence. And I know that right there might sound blasphemous to you, and if it does, again, you can say as much, and I even encourage you to, in the comments below. But a couple things to keep in mind is that George Lucas is obviously not going to live forever, and it was ultimately his choice to sell it to Disney, which could either mean he just wanted an even bigger boatload of money to sail off into retirement on, or he himself thought it was best for the future of Star Wars. And when I first heard the announcement back in October of 2012 that Lucas had sold to Disney and a new trilogy was going to be made, I was both scared and excited. Excited we were going to get more Star Wars, and likely a lot more under Disney, and scared because what did Star Wars without Lucas mean? What would it look like? How was a giant corporation like Disney, one who loves money, like any corporation really, going to craft Star Wars the same way Lucas had? Surely they couldn't get this right. Surely it was a disaster waiting to happen. But then I remembered Disney owns Marvel, and even back in late 2012, it was clear that they had allowed Marvel to mostly do its own thing, to create the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which has reshaped and influenced the movie industry on perhaps the same level the original Star Wars trilogy had several decades earlier. Because when you watch a movie from the MCU, you can almost literally feel the love and passion that goes into it, because these movies are being created by people who truly care and respect the property. So I had high hopes even then that Disney would be wise enough to let the people at Lucasfilm, people who have a deep love for Star Wars and an understanding of it, run the show for the most part, to make most of the decisions that would determine the future course of the franchise. Something that, again, they were doing with Marvel and the MCU, and something that other corporations, such as Warner Brothers with the DC Expanded Universe, don't seem to understand. And yes, I have argued before that there is no doubt that after spending $4 billion on Lucasfilm, Disney has likely been standing over the shoulder of Lucasfilm, watching everything they do very, very closely, especially here at the start. They've likely even given some directives on what they want to see Star Wars become. I mean, you don't spend that kind of money on something, with hopes of it being a huge revenue generator for literally generations to come, and just turn over control of it completely to Lucasfilm and hope for the best. Blind trust isn't exactly the best way to run a business, and you still have to make sure that those people who have a profound love for Star Wars at Lucasfilm are making sound decisions. And all this pretty much brings us to the biggest difference between when Lucas owned Lucasfilm, and hence Star Wars, and now with Disney owning it, and that is, George Lucas owned it outright. It was completely his to do with as he pleased, and he answered to no one. If he wanted to make another holiday special, and this time have it feature Jar Jar Binks singing bombad Christmas songs for an hour while Ewoks danced about, no one could have stopped him. And if you've ever watched any of the behind the scenes footage from the prequels, where everyone just nods their head and says, "Great idea, Mr. Lucas," to anything he says, you know no one really tried to stop him do anything then. Whereas, if he'd listened to more people, perhaps the prequels would have been better. And I'm not saying I hated them, but there was certainly room for improvement and input from others. And no, I'm not blaming those who just went along with all George Lucas's ideas, because in their shoes, I would have no doubt thought to myself, who am I to argue with the guy who created Star Wars about Star Wars? Who am I to tell George Lucas he's wrong about it? But if Lucas would have had someone to answer to, for better or worse, the prequels would have been different. If someone would have had the power to say to George Lucas during the creation of Episode 1 that, this Jar Jar character needs to be toned down quite a bit, and some of your dialogue could use some polishing in some places, well, I think there's a good chance Episode 1 would have been a better movie. And that then brings us to Disney, which is a publicly owned company, which means they have shareholders to answer to. And sure, you can argue that Disney and those shareholders have agendas for Star Wars that go beyond just making money from it. But that's not really something I want to get into here. Nevertheless, I think we can all still agree that those shareholders want to see Star Wars continue to be successful for many, many years to come. They want to see it make a lot of money. And though that might immediately sound like a bad thing, keep in mind that in order for Star Wars to be a huge financial success in the long run, and I'm talking for decades here, they have to continue to produce quality products for us customers to consume, and they want us to keep coming back for more. They have to continue to make great movies year in and year out. And sure, they know at this point people will go see pretty much anything called Star Wars, but it wouldn't take more than a couple bad movies for that to change. It wouldn't take much for people to turn on them if they start to ruin Star Wars. And you might personally think that The Force Awakens and or Rogue One has already started to do that. And you're certainly not alone if you feel that way, since both movies do have their critics. I myself did not love The Force Awakens as much as I thought I would, or even wanted to. But I cannot deny both movies were highly enjoyed by the masses and made a lot of money. Both were no doubt successes on basically every level for Disney. Still, both were relatively safe ventures that played heavily off nostalgia, with The Force Awakens feeling in many ways like a complete homage to the original trilogy, while Rogue One firmly affixed itself to A New Hope by basically making itself a prequel or a lead-in to that movie. Not to mention, it had Darth Vader in it, which meant people were going to see it. However, you can't play off nostalgia forever, or that too will get old and cause fans to turn on you. And if George Lucas had made Episode 7, I guarantee it would have been radically different than The Force Awakens. He would have given us something fresh and new, not something that felt like an updated version of the original trilogy. Which then brings us to The Last Jedi, the movie I truly feel will be an indicator for the future, or at least immediate future, of all things Star Wars under Disney. The true precedent setter, if you will. Because as I've said before, and I'll say again here and now, I expect this movie to be the start of changes to Star Wars. And what those changes are, I've speculated on elsewhere, and I won't get into now. But I am fully bracing myself for them, for good or bad. Though I do think Disney is smart enough to let those at Lucasfilm, again, as I said earlier, those who truly love and understand Star Wars, to be the ones that make most of the calls as Star Wars sets out into an unknown future. And though by no means do I have an insider's view, but from here on the outside, it seems like there is a true team effort in place. And I think that's in large part thanks to the Lucasfilm story group. There is an impressive level of cohesiveness when it comes to everything in the new canon, and I think it's mostly because of their work. It truly feels as if they're crafting one massive story, one comprehensive history of a galaxy far, far away. The depth I feel Star Wars has been given in these last 5 years has been very impressive. And as imaginative as George Lucas and his movies were, he was never one to sweat the details or care about the little things a lot of us fans obsess over. And I think the inconsistencies between the prequels and the original trilogy is proof of that. Because clearly, when writing the prequels, his top priority wasn't to make them flow perfectly into the original trilogy. His priority was to tell the story he wanted to tell. And I don't fault him for that. George Lucas no doubt sees himself as a storyteller, not a universe builder, if you will. And despite what many people believe, George Lucas did not have it all figured out way back in the mid-70s when he wrote the first Star Wars movie. There was no eureka moment in his life when he suddenly thought of every single secret in the Star Wars galaxy and how every story would unfold. In many respects, he was just making it up as he goes. And something like not deciding to have Luke and Leia be twins till Return of the Jedi is proof of that. proof that the story was constantly evolving in that impressive imagination of his. And honestly, I don't think George Lucas sees Star Wars the same way as we do. I don't think he loves it the same way that the fans do. And I know that might sound like the dumbest thing I've ever said, because of course I know he loves Star Wars, he loves his creation. But at the same time, Star Wars has completely defined him and his life's work. And I can't believe that was even remotely his intent when he was making A New Hope, or as it was known then, just Star Wars. I can't believe that as a young filmmaker, barely in his 30s, he wanted to make a movie that would be all anyone would ever want him to do again. Because that's all we fans really ever wanted from him. We wanted him to keep making more Star Wars movies. We begged for more of it, and when he finally gave us the prequels, there was at least some portion of the fan base who hated him for it. They hated everything about those movies, and even went so far as to say George Lucas had ruined their childhood, which is all very sad and ironic. And I highly doubt while writing the prequels, and episode 1 in particular, that he thought to himself at any point that I'm going to make a movie just for the fans, one they're going to love. And that's not saying he didn't care about the fans. I'm sure he did. It's just saying he didn't worry about catering to us, which could be seen as either good or bad depending on your point of view. But it meant we were always going to get something new and completely original. It meant we weren't going to be pandered to, that we were going to be surprised by the direction the story took. Lucasfilm under Disney, however, is going to have pretty much the opposite approach. They care a great deal about the fan base and what they want, which might make you roll your eyes. But when I say fan base, I mean it in the most general sense of the term. I don't mean just the diehard fans only, which is likely the category you watching this fall into, but rather I mean anyone and everyone who goes and sees a Star Wars movie on a regular basis. And when you really think about it, casual fans or average moviegoers make up a huge percentage of the potential audience, or potential revenue, and they can easily lose interest or pass on seeing the new movie if the last few haven't appealed to them for whatever reason. And if enough of them begin to pass, that seriously hurts Disney's bottom line. While with us diehard fans, it's pretty much a given we're going to see the new movie and buy some merchandise. And though some of us will say, we'll boycott Star Wars if Disney ruins it or does this or that, how many of us will really hold to that? Honestly, probably not enough to give Disney pause for concern. And that's not to say we're taken for granted or overlooked by Disney, because we are given an abundance, and maybe an overabundance, of other sources of canon to consume, thanks to the animated shows, the novels, the comics, the games, and so on. And you may say that's just Disney trying to squeeze even more money out of us, and maybe it is to some extent, but it's also nice for us fans who can't get enough Star Wars to have these extra stories, to not have to wait a year between movies to get more. And sure, you might say that that's nothing new, that we had the expanded universe back during the reign of George Lucas, and that quenched your need for constant Star Wars. But again, I go back to the cohesiveness of it all now, the level of detail they're putting into creating this galaxy, and also the way they're keeping the stories a bit more reined in instead of letting authors run wild with these crazy ideas, which tended to happen in the expanded universe. Not to mention, even though George Lucas allowed the old expanded universe to happen, he never really cared about it. He never thought of it as his Star Wars, which always lessened the way I look at it and felt about it. And sure, you could then say all it ever really was then was a blatant cash grab on George's part, that he allowed the Star Wars name to be stamped all over these stories that he didn't even care about just to make money. But he could also look at it as him realizing there were people who wanted more Star Wars than he could ever personally hope to give them, and he allowed other storytellers, in some respect, to play in his sandbox and fill a need. And now those others aren't just filling a need, they have become the future. They have become the quote-unquote real Star Wars. New and creative minds like Rian Johnson are being asked to fill the void left by George Lucas and continue the story of Star Wars. And if Lucasfilm itself is to be believed, they are giving these new storytellers the freedom to tell the tales they wish to tell, yet with the oversight to keep things in check when need be, an oversight that, for good or bad, Lucas never had to deal with. And right now, just days away from The Last Jedi, I feel cautiously optimistic about the future of Star Wars. Again, in my opinion, neither The Force Awakens nor Rogue One were great indicators of things to come, while I believe The Last Jedi will be one way or the other, even if I'm dead wrong and it offers nothing new and different, or if it's just a clone of The Empire Strikes Back. Because that will then tell me that their plan is to try and keep it as familiar as possible, that they're not going to take any risks or chances with the story, chances Lucas himself would have thrown caution to the wind and no doubt taken. Would that be a good or bad choice? Well, that's hard to know, but I do believe Star Wars has to evolve, at least in some respect, from what it was under George Lucas. And it will continue to have to evolve as the years go by, because times change, people change, and what we demand out of entertainment also changes. And the question now is, can Lucasfilm under Disney, a Lucasfilm without the man it was named after, keep Star Wars at the top as the most beloved franchise in the world? Well, that's all I've got for you this time. And now I'm really curious to hear what you have to say on this topic. Who does Star Wars better, Disney or Lucas? And I know how absurd that question might sound to you, because it sounds absurd as I say it. But instead of just taking to the comments to bash Disney, I ask you to take this opportunity to really give your thoughts on this matter. And then hopefully next week sometime, I'll try to highlight some of your comments and discuss them in the follow-up video. So until then, thanks for watching.